All right. Well, welcome officially to this introduction. As I'm sure you are all aware, the theme is healing trauma and the path of recovery, something that I call a compassionate relational approach to a gestalt approach to working with trauma and addiction. And what we're going to do today is just cover some of the basic ideas around this concept of understanding trauma and addiction from a gestalt perspective, some of the basic ideas on the work and components that I believe are important. And it is an introduction to the module, to this full 6 module training that we're going to be doing online starting in August 23rd on Friday. If you're in the Americas, Friday evening. If you are in the Southern Hemisphere, it's going to be Monday, Saturday morning, depending on what you are, between 8, 9, 7 a.m. to up to 12 p.m., depending on what country you are in, either Australia, New Zealand, or parts of Asia. And it's a 6 module, 3 hour per module training where we go into much more depth into some things that we're going to be covering today. As I mentioned before we got going, if there's any questions, any thoughts along the way, feel free to ask, to share your thoughts and comments, and we'll get started. Normally, before I jump into the lecture, I like to give a little bit of context to how these trainings came to be, how some of these ideas came to be, just to give a little bit of context. So a couple of things that I think are really important. One is my limitations by geography, language, and culture in terms of some of the things that I'm going to be teaching. I've been blessed to have the opportunity to work with people from all over the world and to hold this type of trainings in this virtual mode, in having people from different parts of the world together, or do some in-person or online trainings with different people from different cultures. And one of the things that I'm keenly aware is that there are certain things and materials out there available that might not be in any of the languages that I can read or speak, which is Spanish and English. And also that there are cultural, nuances and differences that I live in the United States, in San Diego, which is in the corner of the United States with Mexico. I was raised in Mexico. I am Mexican, and right across the border on Tijuana. So Tijuana and San Diego are then the corners of both countries. So a lot of my experience, professional experience, is mainly in this part of the world on both sides, and an understanding of the two cultures and the collision and integration of the two cultures. So just know that as I'm sharing some of these thoughts, there are certain aspects that if they're outside my awareness, I'm happy to learn. And that's the best part of connecting with people in other areas, that I'm always learning different perspectives and ideas. So the context of how this came to be, I when I went to university, one of the things that I was very aware of is that I never wanted to work with addiction. At that point in my life, addiction and substance abuse were synonymous. One of the things that we're going to be talking about today is that addiction is not just about substance abuse. There's many other ways that we can get stuck in compulsive addictive patterns with relationships and emotions and behaviors and so on. And the primary reason, without going into too much detail to take too much time from the other parts of the lecture, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of alcoholism. All of my mom's brothers pretty much were alcoholic. Every family get together, people got severely intoxicated, and they were either a lot of jokes or fights or both. And I remember when I first, started studying and realized there was a treatment for addiction, my initial thought was, I'm not going to deal with that. That's impossible, unfixable, uncurable. That's not for me. And then I started working in psychiatric hospitals in different places. I was really intrigued by psychosis. One of the things that was I was very aware early on is how this, unprocessed painful events that we call trauma can be very shaping, even with psychosis. There was so much of psychosis that once you understand what was behind the delusions and certain things, there was always some sort of real pain, life situation that got reorganized in an odd way. And and working in this and working in a hospital, working in different settings, of course I was working with people who were struggling with substances because it's fairly common. But it got to a point in my career where I needed a challenge. I was feeling bored and decided to go and work in an outpatient program specializing in dual diagnosis, so a mental health disorder and a substance abuse diagnosis. And I was really surprised on how engaging and interesting this work was. There was something that I discovered back then many years ago. It's not a very unique discovery. It was unique for me that to understand addiction, you have to understand trauma. For most addictive behaviors or substance abuse, there's trauma in the story. And that just made sense for me. Once I was able to make those connections, suddenly the work with substance abuse became really interesting and really fascinating. I was really engaged to understand it. So, and from that point on, I have worked primarily with addictions and different types of addictions. But there was this sense that one of the challenges that I was seeing in the field, and this is in the gestalt field, but in the psychotherapy or psychology or mental health treatment field in general, was this misunderstanding of addiction and treating addiction as this disease that it's uncurable and can only be controlled through abstinence. And it could be abstinence of a substance, abstinence of porn, abstinence of gambling, abstinence of, codependent relationships, whatever it might be. And it was missing something that for me felt really important because in my gestalt bones, that didn't feel like enough. And yes, you abstain and then eventually you get to understand the trauma and you do some trauma work. There was a piece that felt really important, which is to understand addiction from a functional perspective, which is a bit of what we're going to be talking about today, and we cover in depth in the full training, is that instead of looking at addiction as a symptom or looking at addiction as a destructive behavior or even anesthetizing behavior, to understand what function and what role does it play in the individual story, in particular in helping and manage survival. So when I came to that, it felt really important to bring it to others, to have conversations to others. There's a book, some of you probably have heard, Gabor Mate. He has become quite famous. He has a book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghost, which is a really great book that really paints a good picture on this relationship between trauma and addiction. And in reading his book, it really helped me in so many ways. It was like reading what I was seeing in clients and what I was thinking about. And somebody was writing about these things that I was coming to in the work with clients. Because so much of what I believe is powerful and what I talk about and what I teach about has come with the interactions with people, with the learning from our clients, with being able to be curious about the work that's being done and curious about the people. And when I teach and when I write, there's so much of it that has come from that. And then later on, or before or in the middle of all of it, it's understanding the theory, understanding the concepts, understanding how the brain works and several things like that. In the training, we go a little bit into depth and understanding the neuroscience of trauma and addiction. We're not going to do it in the introduction because it will take too long if we added that. And early on, when I was doing these free lectures, I tried to push so much in that it was impossible. And we go into the polyvagal theory as well during the training. I have decided since to not include those topics in the introduction because then it ends up being this very rushed conversation to try to cram everything in a short time. So instead of doing that, I'm going to focus primarily on the ideas around trauma and addiction from what I believe it's a more gestalt relational understanding of these two areas, the relationship in between, and a little bit about some of the treatment ideas or the how to work with trauma and addiction. So the first piece is to begin to broaden our sense of what addiction is. I already mentioned this in the introduction. When we're talking about, or let me rephrase that, when I'm talking about addiction, I'm referring to a broad sense of the meaning of that word. Because it could be substances, of course. It could be behavioral addictions, like certain processes, gambling, uh, falling in love. It could be relational addiction, and it's not exclusive to romantic relationships. I work with people that have pretty unhealthy codependent relationship with friends or parents or uncles. So it's not exclusive to romantic sexual behavior. It's relationships when somebody can become addicted to. And also sex. And sex is not necessarily with a partner. It could be pornography. It could be certain type of sexual acts. And what makes the difference, right? One of the things that I want to start with is to have a sense of, a definition of our understanding and what addiction is. What does addiction include? And I haven't found a definition of addiction that truly resonates with me. The one I'm going to share with you, I think, covers the aspects of addiction in the best way possible that I've seen so far. But the old school definition of addiction was basically you're misbehaving, you're a deviant, you're a liar, and you need to be punished until you stop. That was the old school way of treating addiction, especially substance abuse. You would go into treatment that would break you down, that would humiliate you to the point that you felt like the worst person in the world. So then you would never use again because you would feel so horrible and shitty that you would never do it again. That obviously was not very effective, and it came with a lot of consequences. So the medical model was a much better option. So before, the treatment for addiction was prison, right? People would get arrested for having addiction problems and for being disruptive. Medical model comes into play, and instead of sending people to be incarcerated, they were sent to the hospital or psychiatric hospitals, and they were treated, sometimes medically. And the idea of the medical model is that addiction is a brain disease, that it's uncurable, so your brain stops functioning in a healthy way, and the treatment for addiction is to abstain. So stop doing this bad thing that you're doing, and your life is going to be better. Much better than the previous one, the criminal one, but it's still missing some very key components. So in the book that I mentioned earlier, in Gabor's book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghost, he talks about a definition of addiction that he pastes together from different sources and different places. And I like this one a little bit more. I think that it gets us a little bit closer to what I believe it's a more functional understanding of addiction. So what Gabor, there are three components. Hold on, I'm sharing the wrong screen. This happens sometimes. Give me 1 second, so it looks nicer for you. So the what he says is that there are three components that addictive behavior in some way needs to have or need to be present for us to say, all right, this falls into the realm of addiction. The first one is that there is craving or relief or pleasure in the short term. So what this basically means is that people tend to get addictive or tend to engage in behaviors, substances, and whatever it might be that are pleasurable to the individual and that provide relief either to a craving or to an uncomfortable situation, or just simply it feels good when you do it. There's a lot of things that feel good. There's a lot of things that are enjoyable. Obviously, not everything's addicted. Not every enjoyable behavior is addictive. But the key component of addiction is that there is this short-term pleasurable experience when I engage with this activity or this behavior or this substance. In what is it, like 24 years that I've been doing this, I have not met a person that has become addicted to something that is not enjoyable. It might only be enjoyable to them, but it is still something that for them is enjoyable. The second component is that engaging in these behaviors has negative consequences in the long term. So eventually it starts to have problems, it starts to create difficulties in their life, either relationally, at work, in their ability to function, physical consequences, psychological consequences, so that it begins to have a negative impact in their life. A lot of the times, this is where some of those early definitions stop. You engage in something and it has negative consequences, and you continue to do it. For me, the part that really makes a difference in this definition is this third aspect, that there's an inability or unwillingness to give it up, which is different than you continue despite the negative consequences, which is the old definition. The idea here is that I am unable or unwilling to stop. For me, this makes a significant difference because it's not that I'm not aware that it's hurting me and my loved ones. It's not that I'm not aware that this engagement in this behavior is not healthy. It is that despite those negative consequences, despite the fact that it is hurting me and hurting others, I cannot stop. I cannot give it up. This is not a rule because there's no rules in our field, but what I notice is the greater the destructive the addiction is, the more it continues, despite the fact that negative consequences pile up. In most cases, the more severe the trauma is, the more I need to disconnect and anesthetize and not be present. So if we take this idea of the definition, so I have this short-term benefit, long-term consequences, and despite all these consequences, I am not able to stop and I'm not able to give it up. I'm willing to trade. For a lot of people, they're keenly aware of this. I'm willing to trade sometimes seconds of pleasure, intense pleasure, for hours and days of despair and pain and suffering that's going to come afterwards. But I'm trading off because that moment is so powerful and so necessary. So this is telling us something about addiction that's very important, that there's something that's happening in this part of their life that has learned to survive in this way, that to live without this is much more threatening than to continue to do something that's destructive. So in order to understand addiction, we need to look at it from a different perspective, because if we just stay in the present where this destructive thing is happening in your life and you're not stopping no matter what, it makes it very, very hard to connect. It becomes like this nonsensical behavior that you just continue to do for no apparent reason. So if I shift my understanding, I need to begin to look at addiction from a developmental perspective. What does this mean? I need to look back to when the engagement with the behavior began, before it became problematic, when it was still functional, what I call a functional creative adjustment. There was a period in time in somebody's history, in most people's history of addiction, that if you go back to their story, you're able to see that this was the way that they adapted at one point in their life. Normally around teenage years, sometimes a little bit later, sometimes as early as 8. I have worked with clients where they found this way through this substance, through being excessively good in school, through being liked by the opposite sex, to engaging in pleasurable activities, through stealing, through whatever it might be, that there was this amazing dopamine dump that for that moment made the problem seem less problematic. It allowed me to socialize. It allowed me to make friends. It allowed me to be funny. It allowed me to connect with people. So that part that I'm carrying of this an inability to be in the world, it suddenly disappears and it works. The thing about most things that eventually become addiction is that at one point they were working. Now, functional and healthy are two very different things. But even though it might not have been the healthiest choice, it was the most effective choice. And that's a really important piece to understand. We need to look at the historical relationship with the addictive behavior. And sometimes the addictive behavior moves. It was something completely different when I was younger and eventually evolves into different things. But to understand it from a functional perspective, so what was it doing? In what ways? Sometimes it's self-medication. But the bottom line is that every addictive behavior, it doesn't matter what it is, the ultimate goal is to change the chemistry of the brain. That's what addiction does. It's related to dopamine. It's related to oxytocin. There's a lot of different neurotransmitters there are involved in this. But the best way to understand that is that when I engage in these moments, it allows me to have enough space between pain, unresolved attachments, unprocessed emotions, whatever it might be. We'll jump into that in a moment. And it allows me to have a moment of breathing, a moment of separation. And not only that, a lot of the times it gives me a sense of security. I can be funny. I have this social lubricant, but I'm no longer afraid to engage with people or actually start getting better grades. I have had tons of clients that as soon as they started smoking marijuana, they suddenly were better students because they were not as anxious and worried that they couldn't focus. And suddenly that goes away and they're able to do better in school. So if we look at it when it's in its most destructive phase, addiction makes no sense. But when we understand it from the function that it was taken care of many, many years ago, and it still does today in some way, but I think that what happens is the level of disruption and complications makes it so much harder to be able to see it clearly, that it's not as clear as it was when it first started. Some of you have probably heard of this example, but it's commonly used in the teachings about addiction, and I think it's the best example in terms of understanding addiction. So the idea is that addiction is similar to the process of boiling a frog. For those that don't know, I had no idea until I read this. The way that frogs are boiled, for some reason, which is horrific, they're boiled alive. So what happens is that they put them in the water when the water is nice and comfortable, because if the water is boiling, you throw a frog in there, it jumps out. So what they do is they put them in the water while it's nice and comfortable, and very, very slowly increase the heat. And it's such a gradual process that by the time they realize the water is boiling, it's too late for them to get out because they're already cooked. That is the best understanding of addiction. When we're seeing somebody in their adulthood and they have like this long story of addictive behavior and it's so destructive, they have no idea how it got to the water being so boiling. It's hard to understand it. It's already too late to try to comprehend it. So the only way is to go back to when the water was nice and comfortable, when things were functional. It was actually helping them get through a moment and survive. Before I get going, I just want to check in to see if there's any questions, any thoughts about any of this. Right. Yes.
I'm listening to you, and I was thinking, as you mentioned, that you were looking for the right definition for addiction.
Yes.
And it resonated with me that addiction is a jail, in a way that, well, under different circumstances, and you can look at it, and that's how it resonated with me. And the question that came out of it was, can suffering be an addiction?
It's a good question. And I think that for some people it can, but it's hard to put it in that simple statement. I think that there's a context to the suffering. And a lot of the times, the suffering comes as a consequence of engaging in unhealthy relationships or in unhealthy behaviors. And I end up in this sense where I feel victimized, or I feel like this constant sense of not feeling loved or valued or whatever it might be that leads into this pain and suffering. And what I think is true is that a lot of times it's the cycle what's addictive. I work with a lot of people where they're in this unhealthy, especially in codependent relationships, right? Where there is this moment of connectiveness and joy, and it's the best sex they ever had, and they feel like they're in love, and then no one's gonna love like this person in the world, and they know that pain is gonna come because they've been through it enough times, right? This is not gonna last. And then the cycle turns, and now they broke up, and they got into a big fight, and they said horrible things to one another, and they hate each other, and I'm alone, and now I'm never going to be loved in this way but any other way. And that is as gratifying and enlightening and exciting as the other side. So I think that sometimes when you look at the whole, the suffering can be part of the addiction cycle. And it's almost like enjoying that pain because eventually I'll get my reward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that addiction can feel like a jail, to your analogy earlier. I think that the part that is challenging sometimes to understand is that jail is very safe. It is very comfortable. And I have no surprises in that jail because I put myself, not necessarily with the conscious awareness, but it's a way of surviving. I lock myself up to be safe, and then I can't get out. And this happens in so many ways. There's a lot of times when I'm working with somebody and they have like they say, I created this big wall around myself to be safe. And that way nobody can hurt me. I'm alone and nobody can hurt me. The problem with that is that no one could get in, but you can't get out either. So you're left with loneliness and aloneness. Very safe, but very miserable. And that is a great way of understanding this, that the trade-off for a lot of folks is that I can guarantee my safety by managing my misery. So it's a way of as long as I have this control, and you probably have worked with clients like this before. I remember somebody very clearly. They were engaged in this new relationship. Things are going well. This person's treating them with respect. They feel connected, and suddenly they break it off. And then I'll be like, what happened? The relationship ended. And they say, I'll rather end it now and control the pain than wait until they leave me. So this way I could end it and get hurt now versus waiting for the hurt to happen when it's not under my control. So I will hurt myself first so the other person doesn't get a chance to hurt me. And that's an adaptive way of surviving. It's quite efficient. I mean, not pleasant, not enjoyable, but very, very efficient. So when we begin to think about addiction, there is this great idea. I believe this is Gabor Mate as well. I'm not 100% sure. I'm 90% sure this is his quote, that when we begin to understand addiction from this functional perspective, we begin to see that the reality is that addiction is not the problem. It's the attempt to solve the problem. So it's the ways that I try to solve this pain, this uncomfort, this sense of inadequacy, this fears of not being loved, not being seen, sense of not feeling validated. And I suddenly, find this way that gives me a momentary sense of relief or validation or comfort. So it becomes problematic, but it was the attempt to solve the problem. So if we think about this for a moment, right? So we have the option as clinicians to how we meet our clients, what we bring to the therapeutic relationship. I could see this person as a lying, manipulating, cheating person who uses or this addictive behaviors as a way of disconnecting and takes advantage of people. Or I could see this person as somebody who has pain and found a way of surviving through this pain that with time has become maladaptive and destructive in their life. I don't know about you, but that one's a lot easier to relate to. It's so much easier to work with someone who had found ways that became destructive to survive versus someone who's manipulated and cheating and lying and I can't trust. And that's the stance of addiction that I believe needs to shift. If I could understand this, as frustrating as it is, as tiring as it is, because when you're working with somebody in recovery, more than likely there'll be relapse. More than likely there'll be moments where they're hiding things from you. But they're not hiding it from us. It's not an active act against us. It's an old way of adapting and surviving. And yes, it pushes people away. Yes, it creates distrust. And eventually, most addictions, if not all, end in isolation. I don't think that isolation is a consequence of addiction. I think it's the underlying goal, because there is nothing safer, once again, than being completely alone and nobody coming near me and people not wanting to be around me. That is the safest possible stance. Miserable, once again, but safe. And that sometimes for a lot of folks is the trade off. So if addiction is not quote unquote the problem, then what is it taking care of? And I think that's when we start to make this connection with trauma. Before I talk about trauma, there's something that I want to clarify, because I think that the word trauma, especially nowadays, it has become a very in term. It's very popular. Everybody's talking about it. It's become a very in vogue term. This happens in psychology every decade, or every 22 years, we get a nice new famous thing that everybody's talking about. In the 80s, it was stress. Everybody was talking about stress. That was the in vogue term, right? Everybody was talking about stress. Nobody understood it, but everybody was talking about it. Self-esteem is another one that became very popular in the 90s. And everybody was talking about their self-esteem without really understanding what it means. We're in somewhere with that now, which I think there's a lot of positive, that there's more trauma awareness in the general population, and people are more aware of trauma and more attentive to the fact that sometimes I'm carrying pain and I need to deal with it. But I think that at times it's grossly misunderstood, because I think that we tend to overemphasize the events or the situations as traumatic. And yes, that's a way of understanding trauma, but it doesn't really capture, from my perspective, what the essence of trauma is. Because in order for us to have a better understanding of trauma, that we need to understand that it's not about what happens, it's about the consequences, what happens later. It is linked, obviously, to what happened, but the event ends. But the aftermath of the event not ending, that is trauma. There is, some literature up there and some trainings where they talk about small t trauma and large t trauma. So meaning like there is this more significant events that are very painful and big, and that's the big T trauma. And then there are like smaller life events, that's the small T trauma. I personally extremely dislike this concept of the large T and T trauma. I don't agree with it. I don't think that's a good way of understanding it. I have a perspective that's a little bit different. And the best way that I could explain it is by giving you a little analogy. So if you look at this water bottle and you imagine that this water bottle is a soda can, so made of aluminum, and I take a big rock and I throw it against the can, it's going to be impacted. It's going to have a big dent. It's going to be reshaped. It's not going to be the same soda can that it was before I hit it with that rock. Sometimes there are certain situations in life that have that magnitude impact on us, and sexual abuse, assault, wars, natural disasters, fires, losing a loved one, and so on. But if I take the same can and I hit it constantly with little pebbles, just constantly strike it with little pebbles, one after the other, it's going to be reshaped. It's going to be a different can. It's going to be impacted. But what is impossible is finding the correlationship with each little pebble and each little dent. So the only way to understand what happened to the can is to look at the pile of the pebbles, to look at the whole of the pebbles, and then I begin to understand. But yet it was impacted, it was reshaped. So for me, a better way of understanding trauma, it's the reshaping that happens with situations that impact our life, and we don't have a safe way of processing them, a safe person to hold empathic, compassionate space for us to talk about it safely. Now, what are those little pebbles? Relational patterns, families with constant high expectations or anxiety or a parent that is absent, or emotional dysregulation, emotional absence, that is every day of my life, that it's part of it. And I begin to adjust and adapt who I am and how I see myself in the world and how I see myself in order to adapt to this world. Now, going back to that big rock event, one of the ideas is that most often when one of those big rock events happen, the damage is much more because there was already a bunch of little dents there. So the damage is much more destructive. When I work with a client and they share information about sexual abuse during childhood, which is one of the most horrific things that could happen to an individual, the common question that I ask is, who did you tell? You probably already can guess what the most common answer is. No one. That is the essence of trauma. Yes, the horrific thing that happened to you, but what makes it trauma is that there was no safe person to talk to, that there was no safe person to share it with. Sometimes there is, and it doesn't mean that that assault is not going to impact me. Of course, it's going to impact me, but the long-term effects sometimes can be mitigated if I have a safe center to help me and hold me through that pain, to help me navigate through that, to validate the fact that I was hurt, to hold the fact that what happened was horrific. But when I have to keep it quiet because there's no one I can tell, that's the essence of trauma and the long-term impact of trauma. So let me share the screen here once again. Stephen Porges has, who is the creator of the polyvagal theory, has what I think is one of the best simple definitions of trauma. Trauma is a chronic disruption of connectiveness. Because that is the impact of trauma. And I think that for me, one of the words here that feels really relevant is, and especially as a gestalt therapist, is this word, chronic. Chronic means, long term, something that's there for a long term, and it's not just a temporary illness or terminal illness. It's just there for a long time. But disruption of connectiveness. As a Gestalt therapist, connectiveness, contact, the sense of being able to be in the world in an engaging way that requires for me to put something out there to let other people in, is that ability to connect is disrupted. It doesn't function in the same way. It's distorted. So my ability to see myself and see the world, it's no longer impacted or allowed to be as the way it needs to be in a sense of reality and connectiveness. It is distorted. And that includes how I see myself and see the world. So when we think about the consequences of trauma in adulthood, there's this 4 general areas that helps us understand. One is that there's a loss of response flexibility. What does that mean? My ability to adjust to changing situations becomes more and more limited. The more complex trauma, meaning the more amount of painful, unprocessed experiences that I have in my lifespan, the more challenging it is to be able to adapt and be flexible to different situations and events. So my field to ground relationship becomes very, very narrow and very, very limited. What I'm able to tolerate and I'm able to take in can become so narrow that it's hard to go out, that it's hard to interact with new people, that it's hard to start a new job. Like normal life's tasks that most adults are able to do seem daunting and impossible because there's a sense that my ability to adapt to a changing world is too risky to take that. There's a fundamental disconnect with the self. So one of the things that is fairly common with people who have significant traumas, especially complex developmental trauma, is that there is nothing scarier or more threatening than to be in their body. This is something that we actually have to be really careful with. When in training, I talk a lot about this. We have to be really mindful of our interventions. As Gestalt therapists, we're trained and we're really good at doing body work. You know, what's happening in your body? What do you feel in your body? You know, move your body, whatever it might be, which is great. They're wonderful interventions. But when somebody has significant trauma, that is the worst thing that we can do. Because in our body is where the pain is stored. So actually, one of the worst things that could happen is for me to be in contact with my body. Sometimes people dissociate, sometimes people disconnect. So we have to be aware that this fundamental disconnect with the self is a way of surviving. So being in our body to be able to make space with the essence of who I am, it takes a lot of time sometimes. It takes a lot of resourcing and slow processing to be able to get to that point. So for people, especially with more significant trauma, there's a fundamental disconnect with the essence of who I am, which includes my embodied experience. Because to be in my body is to be with the pain, it's to be with the discomfort, to be with the challenges. So the other piece here, the other aspect of trauma in adulthood is that we have a reshaping of the world. I talked about this a moment ago, but just to go into a little more depth, how I see the world, it's no longer as the world is. It reshapes what is threatening, what is not, what is safe, what is not. I have a tendency to be in a hypervigilant state. So in the sympathetic state where I'm on guard, because one of the other thing besides being in my body that's extremely threatening is being calm and safe, which oftentimes we have to be mindful that we're not doing calming, exercises to ground people, because then what happens if I don't have my guard up? That's when I get hurt. That's when the damage happens. So it shapes how I see the world and what is safe and what is not. And there's a need for hypervigilance in order to stay alive. So calming, relaxing, letting my guard down, it's almost impossible, because that's when pain happens. And the fourth, which I think is one of the most detrimental consequences of trauma, is the inability to be in the present. So what this means is that I don't see the world from the eyes of my adult self. I see the world from a variation of younger perspectives, the hurt child, the angry adolescent, whatever it might be. So it's hard to see myself in the world as an adult, as someone who has choice, as someone who has abilities to communicate and set boundaries. I feel small and little at times. So I have two ways of explaining this. First is a little story that I had. I'll just tell you the story and then tell you how the components came together for me. So some of you might remember this, depending on where you are in the world. I think this is a very, very common practice. But when I was little, I remember going to the circus, and now animals are banned from the circus, both in Mexico and the United States. But when I was little, they had the elephants, and that was one of the main attractions. And before the show started, the elephants were outside the tent, and they were in this area where there was this rope around them, so you couldn't get near them. That was it. There was no big fence. It was just a rope. And they were shackled and chained. So they had shackle and a chain and a stake in the ground that was holding them down. And I remember thinking as a young boy, why doesn't the elephant escape? I mean, it's impossible that because it was just one leg, that there's one chain and shackle is holding this big animal down. So when I was little, I never found the answer to that. I just remember thinking about it. And it was many, many years later that I was reading a book by Jorge Bucay, who's an Argentinian psychiatrist, who's a gestalt therapist. And he has this book with a lot of stories and metaphors. And he talks about a very similar story when he was a boy and saw all of this. The only difference is that he did ask or got the answer, or maybe got it as an adult. I don't know. And basically what happens, which is really horrific, and some of you may know this, is that they shackle and chain the elephant when they're babies. And when they are babies, they do try to escape. and they pull and they pull and they pull until they break their skin or they hurt their leg so badly that they stop. So they grow up, and now that they're this big, majestic, powerful animal, but to that chain and shackle, they're still the helpless little baby that could never get out. That is what happens to humans as well. Those pains of early life follow us and shape that can. That even though I have grown up, I don't have the ability to see that and realize it. I'll give you a quick little example as well. Now it's a personal example. So one of the things that happens to me, especially when I go to conferences and I walk into this room and there's like 200, 400, whatever amount of people, and I don't know anybody. They all might be therapists or psychologists as well, but I don't see anybody that I know. I immediately feel like everybody is an adult except for me. I'm a fairly tall person, and U.S. Imperial, I'm 6'3", and the rest of the world normal measures I'm a meter and 88, so I'm fairly tall. But literally, I feel like I'm looking up, and everybody's bigger than me, and I feel like I can't talk. I don't know how to be an adult, and I just want to run away. Now, I used to get really angry at myself before I did some work and didn't understand why this was happening. And as I, been in therapy since I was 20, I'm 47 now, not continuously, but off and on. There was this sense of understanding that where this fear comes from, that little 6-year-old that was afraid of adults. And now I have choice. I could talk to someone. I could walk around and be quiet. I can leave. I can, find a friendly face. But it doesn't mean that at that moment where that pain is triggered, I disappear and I'm once again a little kid that doesn't know how to react. That is the essence of this idea that we are not able to be in the world from the present moment. Obviously, it's possible with work and processing and healing and so on, but we have this tendency to pull back and see the world from a place where the pain originally started. That is one of the most destructive consequences of trauma in adulthood. So before we get going, I just want to stop for a moment here and see if there's any thoughts, questions, anything that has come up for any of you through all of this.
Could you give more examples on the third aspect of the trauma, because I was not able to understand it?
Which one?
The third one. It's in the bottom.
How it shapes the view of the world?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's in some ways it's somewhat related to what I was just saying, right? So it's not I'm not walking into a room with other adults and I'm an adult as well. I'm walking into a room where everybody's a capable adult and I'm not, right? Or I have to go outside and it's dark and I can't go outside because the darkness is not safe. So I'm not seeing the world as it is. I'm seeing it through this lens of trauma or pain or safety or whatever it might be. So I'm not seeing the objective world. I'm seeing the world through this perspective. But not only does it change how I see the world, which is the impossibility to be in the present moment, it refers to how I see myself. So they're interconnected. I don't see myself as an adult. I see the world as everybody's capable and I'm not.
So It's like trauma becomes part of identity.
In some ways, yes. But it's more that I'm unable to see my essence. So my identity it's buried in the unprocessed pain. My sense of self is buried in the unprocessed pain or challenges or whatever it might be. So it becomes how I am in the world, which we could define that as identity. But the essence of self is not that. The essence of self is very deeper in the adaptive ways that I have disconnected in order to survive. Yeah?
Makes sense.
Good. Thank you. Good questions. So let's talk now a little bit more about the relationship between trauma and addiction, so we can start to put this into a little bit of context. I'm gonna pause here for a moment just to, in order to understand this, I want to talk a little bit, which we go a little bit more in depth in training, but to understand the basic human nature. What I mean by that, what are the basic needs that we need as humans in order to adapt to be in the world? And there's a lot of ways of understanding this. There's a natural need for validation, for safety, for protection, to be cared for as children. I'm talking about children here, young children in particular, 3, 4, 5 years old and younger. But when we think about it in simplest terms, and I like this concept of thinking about it in the simplest terms, there are two basic needs. One is the need to be authentic, that includes all those things that I said. My ability to be able to express myself in the best way that is a natural expression of self. And when you see little children, 3, 4-year-olds, this is very evident. They're into what they're into. Their personalities are very clear. They like to paint, or they like to dance, or they like to play in the dirt, or they like building things, and they have a lot of questions, and they're trying to take in the world. And it's a very natural, authentic expression of self. The true sense of authentic, not this, this is who I am, the world has to, take me in. It's more of a very natural, pure sense of their sense of self is interacting with the world. The other need that is basic in our survival is attachment. So we need to connect or attach to an adult that is going to take care of us. Because one thing that we are intrinsically aware of, without even thinking about it, every child knows that without an adult, we can't survive. We can't feed ourselves. We can't protect ourselves from the environment. We cannot take care of ourselves. We need an adult. So we need someone to attach to. We need someone to connect to, so that our survival needs will be taken care of. Here is the challenge. The need to attach trumps the need to be authentic. What do I mean by that? If I need to be taken care of, I will sacrifice my sense of self. This is a creative adjustment. It's not a conscious choice most of the time, in order to belong to this family system and be attached. So I'd like to give an example, and it's a very simple example just for it to make sense. So if we think about a little girl, 3, 4-year-old girl, and this little girl is very energetic. She loves to play outdoors, and she likes climbing trees, and she likes to wrestle with her friends, and she likes to play with the ball, and she's always like running around. And the parents say, this is not how little girls behave. Little girls are calm and sweet. They play with dolls, they play outdoors, they wear dresses. And the little girl hears this, and the message is, oh, I can't be who I am. I need to be a good girl, so I need to behave in these ways that my parents are telling me. So I will internalize this sense that this is what a good girl is supposed to be, in this how I'm supposed to act. But then once in a while, the tree or the mud or the running around is too tempting. So the little girl engages in that, and parents say, no, you're not supposed to do that. That's not what little girls do. And now there's a sense of, wait a minute, who I am is wrong. And that is the essence of shame. The things that I do, my natural expression of self, is not okay. And I need to adapt. Now, little 3, 4-year-olds don't have the ability to say, like, parents are crazy. Hell with them. I'm just going to be me. That's not possible. It's not within their reality. So the option that I have is, I need to adapt and be this girl that my parents need me to be in order to be accepted, in order to belong, and not misbehave in these bad ways. It's an oversimplistic example. But if you add to that verbal, condescending words or aggression or punishment, whatever it might be, then it starts to create a concept that in order to belong to this family system, I have to be this other person that is not me. And sometimes I'm able to do that. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes the discrepancy between the essence of self and who I'm supposed to be so far that is never possible. And I always feel like a failure or not good enough. So if I don't have the option to believe, man, my parents are messed up, they're wrong. The only other option is there's something wrong with me. I'm not smart enough, good enough, not cute enough, not valuable enough, not smart enough to meet their standards. Here's the thing though. At that moment in time, this is what we call a creative adjustment. Why? Because it's the best option I have for survival in that moment. So in order to connect with my family, it is safer to believe there's something wrong with me, so I have to try harder than to be alone without them and be destitute. So believing that there's something wrong with me is the way that I survive. But what happens is that it creates disconnect. Because in order to believe that, I have to disconnect with myself, with my body, with my emotions. Eventually, there's disconnect with the others and the world, because I am being, in order to be safe, someone that I'm not. And this is how I belong in the world, to not being who I am, to carrying the sense of shame that if myself comes out, there's something wrong with that. It's unwanted. It's not good enough. So this little girl eventually grows up, and now she's an adolescent. And what is the most valuable thing for adolescents in general? To belong, to be part of a group, to be part of something. Yeah, sometimes, it's the essence to begin to express themselves in a clearer way, to have some autonomy. But the most basic, and not just go to any high school, it's to belong, to be a part of something, to be part of a group. So the best way that I have of explaining this correlationship between trauma and addiction is this graph. So on the green side, we have pleasurable activities or behaviors, anything, sex, substances, winning, getting validation through academic success, whatever it might be. There are things that feel good. On their own, they're not problematic. Just engaging with a substance doesn't mean I'm going to be an addict. Just engaging in pleasurable sex doesn't mean I'm going to be a sex addict. So on its own, pleasurable activities are, well, wonderful, important, part of life, great aspects of life. On the blue side, we have trauma, unprocessed emotions, broken attachments, basically simplified pain, human pain, which once again, it's part of the human endeavor. We cannot go through life without having painful experiences, losses, disillusions as part of life. Once again, just because we have these experiences doesn't mean we're going to have, a derailment for the rest of our life. But what happens if we continue with the example of this little girl? If I'm in an environment where my sense of self cannot be expressed, when there is a sense that I have to be someone else, when there's this constant patterns of little pebbles that shape the fact that I cannot express this, I cannot be this way, I'm embarrassed about who I am, and maybe there's some big rocks, some painful events that I couldn't process, couldn't express. And now I jump into the world of adolescence, into preparatory school or high school, and all these cliques, all these people that belong to, and there's this scary sense that I cannot be seen, because if they see me, they're not going to like me, and who am I going to belong to? And there is one group that in all the cultures that I have worked with, it's always open for enrollment. Might be a little bit different. It might be behind the school, it might be in the woods, it might be in a shed, whatever it is. And that's the kids that are either smoking weed, drinking, or whatever other substance behind the school, outside the school, in the woods, whatever it might be. And they don't discriminate. they're pretty welcoming. Plus, you get the benefit of the substance. So suddenly, there's a sense of something that not only am I getting the benefit of, whatever substance is altering my brain chemistry, now I'm part of something. There's a sense of belonging. And this is what I mentioned this earlier, the functional creative adjustment period, where engaging in this behavior simply works. So it allows me to survive, allows me to make friends, allows me to fit in, allows me to isolate successfully, whatever it might be. It doesn't always have to be in terms of making friends. Sometimes it allows me to be alone without being in pain. What happens in the long term, and where it starts to be complicated, is that for a lot of folks, as this continues, this part right here, the trauma and the pain and the addiction or the pleasurable activities become so intertwined that I cannot see my life without it. They become so closely related and entangled up that if I take away this pleasurable activity, all that I'm left with is pain and hurt. So I can only survive and be in the world as long as I'm able to anesthetize the disconnect, even if it's short period of times, even if it's for a few seconds. It's become so interconnected and intertwined that I cannot see my life without it. I often quote this young man that I worked with a few years ago because he was abusing heroin in a very unhealthy, destructive way. And we were talking about the possibility of recovery. And he said, if I stop using heroin, I will die. And he was convinced about it. He was not talking about physical death. He was talking about emotional death. The pain would be so detrimental that he didn't believe that he could survive. And it was a significant amount of trauma, horrific things that happened in his life, and horrific things that happen in his life as an addict as well. Because there's a lot of trauma that happens in adulthood. So his sense was, if I stop this, I will not be able to survive it. So the only way that I stay alive is by disconnecting in those few moments of, injecting the heroin. It goes into my vein. There's this blissful sense of happiness and joy and a beautiful hug that is very loving, that makes everything go away for a moment. It was the only time in his life that he felt held and loved when he would shoot up. So this is the challenge that we're dealing with, a sense of adapting. And as I mentioned in the beginning, to understand what function this is taking care of. So what do we do with this, right? Because if you think about it, the initial offering of therapy is a challenging one, is stop doing this thing that you've been doing to survive. So then you could feel all the things you never wanted to feel. You could talk about all the painful things that you never wanted to talk about. And eventually you're going to feel better. It's not a great invitation. The difference is, what I think it's the most important part of what I'm going to share with you today, is that what we know, or at least what I believe that I hold on to be more specific, is that if we create a space that is safe enough to explore and hold pain, the possibility of healing begins to emerge. And that's the essence of this. And I choose those words very carefully. The possibility of healing begins to emerge, because we don't heal. We don't make people. There's no technique that cures anybody. But what we do create is spaces where that could be possible, where healing can begin to emerge. And to understand healing, what I mean by healing is the possibility that I can experience pain, share it with an empathic human being, and that moment will end. That is the essence of healing, that my pain is not going to last forever. That if I don't disconnect with it, I stay with it. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, but it will end. That's when healing begins to be possible, that I could actually manage my experiences and pain, and those moments pass and life continues on. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, says that when you run away from pain, you run into suffering. And I think that's a very powerful statement, because suffering never ends. It's ongoing. It's just this constant sense of, I don't want to deal with this, so I look away, and it's always there. But when you step into the pain, as scary and difficult as it is, it ends. And the experience of pain, when it's shared with a safe person, so to hold it with compassion and empathy, can be one of the most intimate healing experiences that anybody can have. It could be as intimate, if not more, as sharing love with someone else. To be able to share a moment of pain and be held and seen, not fixed, not told what to do, truly held with it, so I could share it and experience it with someone else. So I'm going to briefly share just some one more concept here in terms of what we talk about, and my way of putting some of this together into some sense of a working model of working with this pain. And the name, I always say this, and for the last few years, I haven't been able to find a better name. I don't love the name. All the name does is a description of what it is. It's a working model. It changes with time. Actually, there's a change on it that I haven't done in this slide. This is an older slide, but I call it the compassionate relational gestalt trauma processing model. That's a mouthful. And the idea of this image, I'm not going to go into detail of everything, but just the general idea why I chose a tree. One is because I love trees and I've always been drawn to them. But second, it's the best analogy to understand the concept of this model, of this idea working. Because these are not necessarily stages or steps or check boxes that we need to mark. They're more of what it holds the possibility of doing this work together. So if you think about a tree without a ground with nutrients and soil, it cannot grow. It's impossible. There's no possibility. So this idea is that the ground for this is this support, stability, resources. This is where we need to spend a lot of the time, especially with more complex trauma. Can I stay long enough in my body? Can I breathe? Can I do nervous system regulation exercises, grounding exercises, here and now exercises, create enough space that I could actually stay in the room without disappearing or fleeing or disconnecting? And then the next for me, which is the most important piece of this, is the trunk of the tree. Because a tree without a trunk is just leaves and twigs. So the trunk of the tree is this thing that I got witnessing, communicating, and validating the experience. What I mean by witnessing, communicating is being with. So to be a witness is to be in the best way that I can present with the other, in the best way that I can taking in the other's experience and putting some of myself in there, really listening and being with. Sometimes I say, seeing with more than my eyes, listening with more than my ears. So there's a sense that is somebody here who sees you, sense of validating your experience and your story. And the validating, in parentheses, I put believe. Basically, what that means is that we believe that what the other telling us is their way of expressing their pain. Sometimes, especially with early developmental trauma, it can be a very convoluted, weird story. Sometimes it's too big for it to be real. What happens is that the pain in the body experiences are real, and our brain creates a story to match that, which sometimes might or might not be 100% accurate, but it doesn't matter. We're not detectives. We are seekers of not the truth, but exploring and being curious about the other. The rest of the tree are just things to pay attention and to be with. But I think this part of that trunk for me is the most important part of the psychotherapy, of the therapeutic relationship. It's about how we are more than what we do. And a lot of times in our field, we get lost in the what. What technique should I learn? What skill should I apply here? And we forget about the how we are. the essence of the therapeutic relationship is this co-created space that creates the opportunity for curiosity and exploration. But that this is something that I'm very keen on, and I've been doing some writing things about, and the possibility of a training on this. But anyway, it's this sense of the essence of healing in a therapeutic relationship, and what is that co-created space, and what do we bring to it? Um, just briefly, because it's there on the right side of the tree. There's this ways of exploring and talk about core beliefs or fixed gestalts, so understanding what are those I'm not good enough, I'm not valuable enough beliefs that might be there. The next one is the one that I haven't edited. It's not making space for my protectors, it's making space for my antagonist. The reason that I prefer the word antagonist is because this is what happens very often. I mean, traditionally in the Gestalt lingo is called resistance. I don't like the word resistance. I'm not going to go into this now because I don't have time to get in a soapbox about resistance. But the idea is that when we're working with someone and suddenly, the typical example is I was working with this guy and he was like really connecting in tenderness with the experiences of his childhood and being his father left and how much he missed him, how alone he was. And then he's like, who cares about this? It happened, 40 years ago. It doesn't matter. This is stupid. This is just stuff that happened when I was a kid. No, it doesn't matter. That's what I mean by antagonist. This parts of ourselves that come in and interrupt the story, that get in the way. But the key is that they're getting in the way. It's valuable. It's an important. So we need to actually welcome those interruptions into the room instead of navigating around them. Understand them. What role does it play? What is it doing for you? What is it taking care of? And this is a really, really important piece of the work, that instead of seeing it as resistance, to see it as a needed part of the therapeutic relationship. On the other side, we have something that as Gestalt therapists we're much more keen to, the sense of emotional awareness, what is happening in your body. It's doing body work and body awareness work. It's a really important piece. And then finally, what an exploration of meaning. What is the transcendence experience of all of this? What does this mean in those moments? Like saying before, I walk into a conference, there's a bunch of strangers, and I feel like a little kid. So, as I said, I mean, that was a very, very quick overview of this, just to get a sense of one of the things. We're going to spend a lot more time, like 2 modules, pretty much talking about this, all the pieces here. But, when I think about this, coming back to the trunk of the tree, and what is our role as therapists? What do we bring to the therapeutic relationship? And I think that one of the best way I have of explaining this is in 3 simple ways. And give me 1 second here. So what I think is our responsibility, the role of the therapist, is that we're responsible for a lot of things, but I think that the things that are key is we're responsible for safety in the relationship. Now, I don't mean this as the other person feeling safe, or yes, I mean a safe space, the office being a safe space, of course, that's part of it. But more is the understanding, which I think is another Stephen Porges quote, which is safety is not the absence of threat. Safety is the ability to connect. So what I mean by safety is our willingness to connect, our willingness to be present with the client, our willingness to be willing to be in contact. And the essence of contact, and it's funny because contact is one of the things that Gestalt therapists like to argue about. But to put it in the simplest terms, what I mean, one of the prerequisites from my perspective of contact is our willingness to be vulnerable. If we're not willing to be vulnerable, we cannot be in contact, which means that I'm willing to put something of me out there. I'm willing to take you in. I'm willing to engage in a human to human relationship and put some of me into this. So there's a possibility for contact to happen. We can't control the other person's willingness. We can't control the other person's ability or not. But what we can is in the best way we can, be willing to be vulnerable and present with the other. And finally, I think that we have a big role in holding hope. Now, by holding hope, I don't mean, things are going to be okay, everything's going to work out, kind of experiences. No, what I mean by hope is the essence to whatever it means for each one of us, that this moment is worth it, that engaging in this therapeutic moment and being with this person is worth it. For me, the essence of hope is, and it includes hopelessness, it includes moments of despair, because I think that sometimes we need to go down to the depths of giving up to get a reason to continue going. But for me, it's the essence that human beings as a whole are worth it. Despite the horrible things that we do to one another, despite the wars and everything that's horrific in the world, there's an essence that human beings are worth putting energy into. That when I'm sitting with someone, is worth it for the greater good of humanity and for the greater sense of that moment. Because if we put that into it, then despite the challenge and despair and the ups and downs, there's something to come back to. I love this story, and I tell it all the time when I'm talking about hope. Some of you might have heard it. I mean, you heard me talk before, you might have heard it then. But anyway, there's this story that I heard when I was probably 20 or younger, and it really resonated for me. I have no idea if it's a true story or not. But basically, this story is that this man, goes to run on the beach on the sand after, a big storm the previous night. And there is tons of starfish in the sand that got washed up by the high tide. And as he starts his run, he sees this 6-year-old little boy, and he's grabbing, the stars and throwing them back into the water one by one. Grab one, runs so back to the water and throws it in. So he goes on his run and comes back about an hour later, and the little boy's still going at it, grabbing one star and throwing it into the water. So the man is curious now about this little boy, and he says, "What are you doing?" And the little boy says, "I'm saving the starfish," and grabs one and throws it into the water. And the man looks, and there's like hundreds, thousands of them. And so he says, "You're never going to finish. And besides, who cares?" And the little boy grabs the starfish and says, "This one cares," and throws it into the water. Grabs the next one and says, "This one cares," and throws it into the water, and so on. That is the essence of hope for me. We might not be able to save everybody, but the people that we come in contact, if we do our best to be with them for one session or 5 years, it matters, because at least for that moment, there's a genuine human being who is seeing them. And that for me is valuable. And it gives me a sense of holding on to. So this is the end of the formal part of the introduction. I'll just put on the screen real quickly as I'm wrapping up, and then we can move into recording interaction. But just as information to get a sense of the 6th module, we start on, if I remember correctly, August 23rd in the Americas, 24th and Saturday 24th in the Southern Hemisphere. So there are the modules there and some of the basic ideas. I mean, there's a lot more in depth to them. Those are just kind of like the headlines. During the process, we do modeling sessions in different moments with people who volunteer. We do a little bit of group activity. It's heavy on lecture on the first module because it sets everything up. But the idea is that we want to make it as interactive as Zoom allows it to be interactive. When you get the email for those people that sign up for the introduction, you will get a code for a little bit of an additional discount for the training. So if you're thinking about signing up or you're interested because you did sign up for this and you make the effort to be here, you get a little bit of an additional discount if you decide to join the course. So that is it. Let me stop the recording now.